Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. He controlled much of continental Europe, but he wanted to force Russia to obey his trade blockade against Britain. Confident in his military genius, he gathered one of the largest armies ever assembled at the time, about 600,000 soldiers from across his empire. The campaign began in the summer, but the Russians refused to fight a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated deeper into their territory, burning villages and crops behind them, a scorched earth strategy that left Napoleon's troops with nothing to eat. The French army kept advancing, growing weaker with every mile. In September, they reached Moscow, only to find it abandoned and set on fire by its own residents. With no supplies and winter approaching, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. The journey back was catastrophic. Temperatures plunged below freezing, horses and men starved, and Russian forces constantly harassed the retreating columns. By the time Napoleon's army staggered out of Russia, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. What was meant to be a quick show of strength destroyed the core of his empire. Within just a few years, Napoleon would be defeated and exiled. This single mistake, underestimating Russia's size and climate, shattered his dominance in Europe. The Bay of Pigs invasion. In the early 1960s, the United States was deeply worried about communism spreading in the Western Hemisphere. After Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba and aligned himself with the Soviet Union, Washington decided to try to remove him. The plan was a secret US-backed invasion using Cuban exiles who opposed Castro. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 exiles landed on Cuba's southern coast at the Bay of Pigs. The hope was that locals would rise up against Castro and the invasion would spark a wider rebellion. But things went wrong almost immediately. The landing force was outnumbered, poorly supported, and the Cuban people did not join in. Castro's troops quickly surrounded them. To make matters worse, US air support was far more limited than promised, leaving the invaders stranded. Within 3 days, nearly all of them were captured or killed. The invasion was a total failure. The consequences were serious. The fiasco humiliated President John F. Kennedy early in his term and pushed Castro even closer to the Soviet Union. The very next year, the world faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing humanity to the brink of nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs is remembered as a textbook example of poor planning and overconfidence leading to political disaster. The Partition of India. By the mid-1940s, Britain was exhausted from World War II and eager to withdraw from its empire. In India, independence was finally within reach after decades of struggle led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. But the question remained, would it be one united India or two separate nations divided along religious lines? Tensions between Hindus and Muslims had already been rising, with the Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah demanding a separate state. In 1947, the British government rushed through a plan to partition the subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. A British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, was tasked with drawing the borders in just 5 weeks, despite never having set foot in India before. The result was chaotic. Entire communities suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the new borders. Around 10 to 15 million people were forced to flee their homes, creating the largest mass migration in human history. Trains packed with refugees were attacked, villages were burned, and an estimated 1 million people lost their lives in the violence. The partition solved Britain's political problem, but left behind a deep scar. India and Pakistan remain rivals to this day, with the disputed region of Kashmir still a flashpoint for conflict. The Iraq War decision. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, the United States shifted its focus to the Middle East. President George W. Bush and his administration claimed that Saddam Hussein's Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a serious threat. Intelligence reports were presented as evidence, and in March 2003, the US and its allies launched a full-scale invasion. The military campaign itself was swift. Baghdad fell within weeks, and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. But the weapons that were used as the justification for war were never found. What followed was far more complicated than Washington had planned. Iraq descended into chaos. With no strong government in place, sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia groups exploded. Insurgent groups targeted US and coalition forces, leading to years of bloody conflict. The war cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, over 4,000 American soldiers, and trillions of dollars. Perhaps the most far-reaching consequence was the power vacuum left behind. Extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS rose to prominence, spreading instability across the entire region. What began as an attempt to eliminate a perceived threat ended up destabilizing the Middle East for decades. Today, the Iraq War is widely regarded as one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes in modern US history. The fall of the Berlin Wall. By the late 1980s, East Germany was facing growing unrest. Citizens wanted more freedom, and thousands were fleeing through neighboring countries. The East German government decided to ease travel restrictions, hoping to calm the protests. On November 9, 1989, a government spokesman, Günter Schabowski, held a press conference to announce new travel rules. But he had not been fully briefed. When reporters asked when the new policy would take effect, he mistakenly replied, "As far as I know, immediately." His words were broadcast on live television. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners gathered at the checkpoints of the Berlin Wall. The border guards were completely unprepared. They had no clear orders, and as the crowds grew larger and more demanding, the soldiers finally opened the gates. People flooded across, climbing on top of the wall, celebrating, and even tearing it apart with their bare hands. What had started as a bureaucratic slip of the tongue ended one of the most infamous symbols of the Cold War. The wall's collapse marked the beginning of German reunification and the wider fall of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. It was a mistake no one planned, but it changed the course of global history almost overnight. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In December 1979, the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan to support a struggling communist government. Soviet leaders believed it would be a quick intervention, similar to how they had crushed uprisings in Eastern Europe. Instead, it became one of the longest and most costly wars in Soviet history. Afghanistan's rugged mountains and tribal society made it almost impossible to control. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, waged guerrilla warfare, striking Soviet convoys and then disappearing into the terrain. The United States, Pakistan, and other nations funneled weapons and money to the resistance, including advanced Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. The Soviet army found itself stuck in a war it could not win. Casualties mounted, and the conflict drained billions of rubles from the already struggling Soviet economy. At home, public support collapsed as coffins returned from a war with no clear purpose. After nearly 10 years, the Soviets withdrew in 1989, leaving behind a devastated country. The failure severely damaged the USSR's international reputation and exposed its weaknesses. Many historians see Afghanistan as a turning point that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union just a few years later. What was meant to be a quick political move turned into a disaster that reshaped global politics. The Treaty of Versailles. When World War I ended, the victorious Allied powers met in Paris to decide Germany's future. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919. On paper, it was supposed to guarantee peace. In practice, it created the seeds of another global conflict. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war under Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. This made them legally responsible for paying enormous reparations, some so large that they devastated the German economy. The country also had to give up valuable territories like Alsace-Lorraine and was stripped of its overseas colonies. Its army was reduced to just 100,000 men. Its navy nearly dismantled, and it was forbidden from having an air force at all. The harsh conditions caused massive resentment among ordinary Germans who felt humiliated and betrayed. Inflation soared, unemployment spread, and extremist political movements gained traction by promising to restore national pride. 2 decades later, Adolf Hitler capitalized on this anger, presenting himself as the man who would overturn Versailles. So instead of securing lasting peace, the treaty directly paved the road to World War II. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. In the late 1930s, Europe was still traumatized by the destruction of World War I. No one wanted another conflict. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed the best way to avoid war was through compromise with Adolf Hitler. This strategy became known as appeasement. The crisis came in 1938 when Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. Rather than resisting, Chamberlain and other European leaders met with Hitler in Munich and agreed to let Germany take the territory without even consulting the Czechs. When Chamberlain returned to Britain, he famously waved the signed paper and declared that it meant peace for our time. But in reality, it was the opposite. Hitler saw this as proof that Britain and France would not stop his expansion. Within months, Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, and by 1939 he invaded Poland. Appeasement had been intended to preserve peace, but instead it emboldened Hitler, gave him more resources, and made World War II inevitable. Chamberlain's decision is remembered today as one of the most costly miscalculations in modern politics. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.